getting part one of last week's podcast. The first hour I see is online, but the second hour I can't find it. I'm just wondering if that too will be posted soon.
Well, as far as I know, it's the part two will be the same title, only it will have part two on it. But I will speak with the production manager and see and make sure that it's on the air. What is your second question?
Okay, the second one is from Mr. Fuller. On the first hour of last week, Mr. Fuller, someone had asked about church. And Mr. Fuller stated that he would consider himself a church. And I was just wondering if he could elaborate on that point.
Okay, good question. Mr. Fuller?
Yeah, sometimes people ask me, and I'm going to be quite straightforward, do I go to church? And I have three codified response, three-part response. I have part one. I have been to church. I stopped going to church. I never left the church. 1, 2, 3. I have been to church. I stopped going to church. I never left the church. Why? What do I mean by that? It means that the church, the way I was told, is a building, which later on I found out is really not.
That's correct. It's not.
All right. So then I said, okay, but I have been to many buildings called a church. Many of them, on many occasions. So, what do I mean by I stopped going? Well, I stopped going when I got there. Whatever that's supposed to mean. In the way that people think of church. Because most people still think of church as being a building.
Yes, they do.
Some bricks, with a roof on it. And, maybe some bells and chimes on the outside of it. And, and a sign out there saying church. Okay? And then you go in and you see some benches. And then you see a podium that's called a pulpit. And you might see some musical instrument called a piano or an organ. And they say that's church. Church. But is that church? That could be just a building with a piano and some benches. Just what you're looking at. They say, oh, no, well, that's part of it, but it's when the people get there. What people? Get there from where? Where were they before they got there? Was that church too? Say, well, no, it's church when they all come together. To get the message. Oh, okay. So now that gets to the second part. When I got to the church, I stopped going. Okay, if they call it a building. You stop going. You're not going to church when you're already in church. If you're going to say it's a building, I'll go with the building thing because most people will say you're not in church until you're in church, and the church is a building. So why don't you come to church? I don't know where you are all out there in that world, but even though the church is in the world, but maybe the church isn't the world. There are some preachers who say, "Oh no, a church is not part of the world." Oh no, the church is something different. Oh, you don't want to be a part of the world. If you're a part of the world, you're not in church. So, but I've thought of that for every way that you can possibly think of. And I'm saying, well, if you leave the building, you don't stay in the building and raise your children and do all the cooking and do your sleeping and do everything in the building, even though there are some places in the world where I understand that happens among people who say that they are monks and they don't ever leave. Okay? But most people leave church, which means once you left, if it's a building, you're no longer part of the church. Yet you say that you're a church member. How can you be a church member when you're not in church? You just left that building because you said that's the church. See the logic of it or the illogic of it? I don't know what's logical. That's the part that I'm making. But I'm still saying those three things. I stick with it. I have been to church. I stopped going to church when I got there. Because once I arrive, I'm not going there because I'm there. And then I say the third one, I never left. Now, what do I mean by that? I go by what every preacher I've ever talked to said you come to church for. You come to get a message. That message is just like going to the post office to pick up a message. And the message is that in a Christian church, you come for one message only. It's only one message. It's not a whole lot of messages. It's a lot of stories. Story of Ruth, story of Matthew, story of Solomon, the songs of Solomon, you know, the story of David and Bathsheba and whatnot. Lots of stories, but it's only one message. What is that message if you're supposed to be a Christian, according to every preacher that I've ever heard talk? Lots of preachers disagree on a lot of things, but every preacher I've ever talked to seems like they agree on one thing, that Jesus of Nazareth, a person named Jesus, died on the cross for my sins. And if I believe that, I will go to heaven. That's the message that I have always been taught over and over and over and over and over again in every church I've ever been in. And so therefore, when I leave the church, the building called a church, I took that message with me. That's why I say I never left the church.
Right.
I took that message with me because they said that's the only message that you came there to get. All the rest of it is just stories, and some people call it entertainment. That's why a lot of black people say, I go to church and we really had a good time.
Yes.
So you're going to church for a good time, or you're going for the message? Well, the message and the church and the good time is all a part of the same thing. But the main thing is the message. I left there. I left with the message, so I never left the church. That's the equation.
All right.